so our braise is finished cooking, but it's fully braised at this point. Now we're just looking to get a little caramelization and to start incorporating the kale and some of the greens. So we have some kale here. The ribs, I've just kind of pulled the ribs out already. So it's kind of just like little tufts at this point. I'm just looking for like a chopped kale, not small pieces. I almost want like big floury pieces. I have also some Swiss chard that I'm going to work with, but Swiss chard is a little more delicate than kale, and so it's going to cook much quicker. That's something I will fold in right at the end. And I'm going to treat the leaves and the stems a little differently than one another with the kale. Let's see, the pork is like nicely braised. At this point I can fully discard that parchment paper. And now I'm just gonna start to incorporate the kale. What's nice is that layer of fat on the top that came off of the pork shank, because there was some fat obviously in the pork shank. Now that fat's gonna get soaked right into these greens. We want a lot of fat with greens, and so it's just like a perfect way to kind of get the fat off the top of our sauce, because this is, we could, in theory, do a lot of things in order to thicken this sauce, because we're not done with this sauce yet. We could puree some of these vegetables into it. We could fold a beurre Marnier into it or a roux into it if we wanted to and bring it to a simmer. Or we could thicken some of the puree some of the vegetables and use them to thicken it. Every decision you make, it's gonna have a different result. What I wanna do is leave it a little bit brothy. I'm gonna use the greens to kind of help soak in some of that fat. And I'm gonna reduce the braising liquid after we've let this pork shank rest for a little while in it. We're gonna let the sauce just kind of reduce so that the braising liquid starts to look a little bit jammy, and we're just gonna use that rather than even thickening it at all. I'm gonna now just kind of vent it a little bit. So if you were using foil, I would just say maybe leave one side uncovered. I've cranked my oven up to 450. Now I'm gonna come back over here. We're gonna work on this Swiss chard. So rainbow chard has beautiful variety of colors. Sometimes there's an orange variety too. You always wanna remove the leafy part from the stem, but the stem is so beautiful and really tasty. Different sort of flavor, but it plays really nice up against sweet and sour. So I'm trimming just the ends. And then I'm gonna go through again and just make sure that I have all these leaves off, because this is where, you know, you can use the natural color of things to kind of work as a garnish. And that's what we're gonna do here. I mean, how beautiful is this? Why not take advantage of the color? So I'm gonna cut these on a bias. I'm just making sure that cutting it so there's a little bit of length. Same thing on a bias, just one at a time, so that I can make sure that I'm keeping them super precise. And by precise, I just mean like the same width and just looking like nice, clean cuts. If I'm using it as a garnish, I'm not rushing through this chopping process. Okay. With this, just gonna kind of fold it on itself, do a little chiffonade. Actually first, if there are some kind of stemmy pieces stuck in there still, you can kind of go through and pull those veins out. They're definitely very fibrous. You could cut through it, you could also chew through it, but if we're going for refined techniques means pulling all pieces out like that. Okay, now we're ready. Now we're ready to chiffonade. So we've got this all kind of on itself. I'm folding this in at the end. It's really gonna wilt down, so I kind of would like to have it like a ribbon almost. 1/4 inch at most thickness. And I'll fold that in at the very end. With the stems, you want to come on over here. I'm just gonna saute these stems lightly in a tiny bit of butter. I'm not really even looking to do much more than heat them up because they're just fine and totally delicious when they're raw. So just warmed in a little bit of butter with some salt is just gonna bring out their natural flavors. Actually, this time of year, although Swiss chard is something that is definitely very earthy in flavor, in the fall it takes on a delicious sweetness because of the cold temperatures. And so having this as a little garnish at the end will be just really pretty and really nice. Little butter, a pinch of salt, just get that butter to melt, and I'm going to shut the heat off. Meanwhile, I'm also going to begin working on the sweet and sour glaze, which is really, really, really simple. You can make it a little more complex if you want to, but I figured I'd break it down for you in a very straightforward and simple way first, because that makes the most sense. So the recipe calls for taking the glaze and just doing, I believe it's 3 tablespoons of honey and 4 tablespoons of vinegar. You're making just a vinegar-honey reduction and adding braising liquid to it, rather than adding vinegar and honey straight to your braising liquid. Balancing that sweet and sour flavor in your braising liquid would be really challenging. You'd have to play with the subtleties of the flavor a lot more. Whereas if you make a glaze and then add a little bit of that braising liquid to it, then you have a small amount of really intensely flavored sweet and sour that you can pour right over the top. That will just give you that sweet and sour bite on the outside and kind of make it just a little more straightforward to get to that sweet and sour flavor. I'll leave it up to you. The way the recipe is written, you're making this glaze first. You can definitely play with the amounts as far as the balance between sweet and acidic, depending on what you prefer with your palate. One of you may prefer more of a sour flavor to a more sweet flavor, and so in that case just err on the side of a little bit less honey and a little bit more vinegar, and vice versa. I always think, especially considering all the other components in this dish, there were a lot of carrots in that braise. That braise with all that caramelization going on, there is a lot of natural sweetness, so I think erring on the side of less sweet makes more sense here. Got a nice acidic bite, almost made me cough, so I know I'm right. Now I'm just going to keep my heat nice and low and let just simmer down until it gets a little bit more syrupy. I'm also going to come down here, check out my kale. My braise really is done at this point. And look how beautiful it's starting to look now. We'll take just a little of this braising liquid. I don't care if there's fat in there at all. That fat will be tasty too. I'll leave the lid off now. At this point, it's done cooking as far as the meat is concerned, but I want the liquid to cook down just a touch more.